Thank you all for spending just a moment in prayer with me this morning. I am going to continue on in this series that we've been in, looking at the book of Hebrews. And it's been an interesting book to get into so far. It's been a challenging book to read. There's a lot of depth and just rich stuff in the book of Hebrews. And there's so many different directions we could go. And we've got a few more weeks left, and I'm excited. This morning, the message is going to be fairly simple and fairly practical. And so I hope that we can do a little self-reflection this morning and kind of look at our lives, see where we're at, and hear God's kind of leading this morning on how we can maybe make some changes to help us look more and more like Jesus. You know, earlier in the year, we studied a book of the Bible that I think since that sermon series has become my favorite book in the Bible. It's the Gospel of Mark. Anybody like the Gospel of Mark? I love the Gospel of Mark. It's like fast-paced. There's not a whole lot of dialogue. It's all about action, and I'm all about action. And I just love the way Mark lays out the story of Jesus. And one thing about the Gospel of Mark is Mark portrays Jesus as a man on the move. Jesus is constantly moving in the Gospel of Mark, going from place to place. He goes across the lake to the other side. Then he goes back across the lake again. He goes to the temple. He goes to the synagogue. He goes into a home. He goes to the city. He goes out into the countryside. He goes up a mountain. Then he comes down the mountain. He's always moving. He's a man on the move. Now, Jesus' followers, naturally, were also on the move. They wanted to be near Jesus, and so they literally followed him wherever he went. And that meant that his followers went on this wild adventure for 3 years, going places they never would have imagined, meeting people they never would have met, experiencing cultures that they typically avoided. They were stretched, they were challenged, they were transformed, and even healed. And they tried to hold fast to Jesus. This is our theme for this series, hold fast. They tried to hold fast to Jesus, and holding fast to Jesus meant that they had to move because Jesus was on the move, and they couldn't be lazy or stagnant. If they were hanging on to Jesus, if they were hanging with Jesus, then they had to move forward, they had to grow, they had to change, because that's where Jesus was taking them. Disciples of Jesus are people on the move. John Wesley, who started the Methodist movement, which we are part of here at Embrace many years later, was adamant that the journey of faith only begins really when someone gives their life to Jesus. You know, churches have focused so much on getting people saved, they forget that that's really the beginning of a long journey, right? At that moment, the process of sanctification begins. This journey of becoming more holy. And it's really a journey of becoming a person full of God, full of love for others, full of love for yourself and who God made you, a person who looks more and more like Jesus. And that journey towards sanctification or Christian maturity is a long, difficult journey. But it's also a journey that's full of joy and excitement and adventure. It's a lifelong journey of becoming more and more like Jesus. Are we moving forward or are we standing still? The preacher of Hebrews was concerned about his friends. He saw a group of people who were once growing, who were once moving forward, but they had stopped. They were once moving in the right direction, but they had slowed down to a standstill and were possibly even moving backwards. So keep that in mind as we read our text for today. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 11, and we're going to go right into the beginning of chapter 6. So I'll read this for you. It'll be, the words will be there on the screen. So he says, "We have much to say about this, but it's hard to make it clear to you, because you no longer try to understand. In fact, though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you the elementary truths of God's Word all over again." It says you need milk, not solid food. Anyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is not acquainted with the teaching about righteousness, but solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. Therefore, let us move beyond the elementary teachings about Christ and be taken forward to maturity. So the preacher here invites his community to move beyond the elementary teachings of Jesus and be taken forward to maturity. Forward to maturity, he says. To move forward to maturity is to become more and more like Jesus. Christian maturity is not talking more and more about Jesus. Christian maturity is not sharing more and more about Jesus. It is being more and more like Jesus. Carlos Rodriguez, who's a Christian leader from Puerto Rico, has great social media presence, by the way, if you want to follow. He's awesome. He has a lot of really just amazing quotes he puts out there. But something he said recently struck me. He commented that many Christians today have really seen Jesus as more of a mascot instead of an example to follow. Too often we cheer and we chant and we clap for Jesus when we come to church, but we fail to follow the example of Jesus. Jesus doesn't need a fan club. He doesn't need the cheers and the chants. He really wants people to follow him and to join him on this journey to see the world be transformed and set free. You know, the preacher uses the illustration of an infant to make his point. You can think about an infant who starts out, with milk, but after a few months is introduced to kind of more semi-solid food, and then after a few more months to solid food, and then eventually gaining most of their nutrition from only solid foods. And it is through that repetition, that consistently eating in more and more solid food that the infant learns to eat differently and grows up. And he says that solid food is for the mature. And who are the mature? He says they are the ones who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. Another translation reads, solid food is for those who are mature, who through training have the skill to recognize between right and wrong. Constant use, he says, repetition, training. This is what brings a person to maturity. Now, the preacher of Hebrews uses some athletic imagery a few times throughout his sermon. So if you hate athletics, I'm sorry, just bear with me. The Roman games were quite popular back then, and people would have understood athletics, achieving physical goals. They would have understood training and what that meant. Athletics are wildly popular today, and so we ought to get these images. And he argues that the mature ones are the ones who train. Training is about what? Setting goals. It's about then working to achieve those goals through repetition, through consistency, and pushing forward even through discomfort and pain. Without training, an athlete will never achieve significant goals. It doesn't matter how many gifts they are given from birth, right? They're never going to achieve the significant goals if they do not train, right? A few of us at Embrace are training for a half marathon right now. And I ran my first half marathon a couple of years ago. And I had the thought that when I started thinking about it, man, I don't know if I can ever run 13 miles. That's like too long, right? No way I can do it. It's just too far. I was talking to high school student last week, and she's like, I could never run 13 miles. And that's kind of how I thought. But my friend shared with me this 12-week training schedule and promised me that if I would follow the schedule, then I would be able to run 13 miles. And sure enough, through the repetition, through the consistency, through the pushing forward, through some discomfort and pain, I improved steadily each week. And by race day, I ran 13 miles, and it was actually easier than I thought it was going to be. And I think we can apply this thinking to so many parts of our lives. I love music, and I would love to learn to play the piano. I would really love to. However, as an adult with lots of responsibility, I'm not sure that I can do it. It's mainly because I'm not sure I would have the time and the energy to practice. You know, when I was a teenager, I had a lot of free time. And so I had lots of time to practice bass guitar and guitar, and that's how I learned and that's how I got better, because I had the time to put into it. You can't learn an instrument without lots of practice, right? You need the repetition, the consistency, pushing forward through that discomfort and pain. You know, our habits, the things we repeatedly do, in many ways, I think, make us who we are. Countless brilliant people throughout history have pointed this out, that our habits form us and shape us. One quote that I particularly like is from a historian and philosopher, and he says this. He says, "We are what we repeatedly do." He says, "Excellence then is not an act, but it is a habit." He says, "We are what we repeatedly do." Our repeated actions, our habits are the things that shape us, inform us. And I would think the writer of Hebrews would agree with this. Jesus understood this. At one point, Jesus said, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And we've often thought of that in reverse, that where your heart is, there your treasure is going to be. And so you need to get your heart right, cultivate a generous heart, and then you'll be generous with your treasure, right? Well, Jesus, I think, says it the other way around here. That the way we earn and spend our money actually greatly impacts the kind of person that we are and the kind of person we will become. Our spending habits, our work habits, our career choices, and so on and so forth greatly impacts the kind of person that we are. Christian maturity, I think, in large part is attained through cultivating habits and practices that help us grow in our love for God, habits and practices that help us grow in our love for one another, habits and practices that help us grow in love for ourselves. I imagine this is why Jesus called followers, because he needed to show humanity how to actually be human. For his disciples, it took 3 years of practice for them to grow into people who had hearts full of love for God, for others, and for themselves. You know, an interesting thing about the Bible is that the same author wrote Luke and Acts in your Bible. And Luke is all about Jesus, and Acts is all about the early Christians. And it's the same author who wrote both of those. And so it's really volume 1 and volume 2 of the same book. It's confusing in the Bible because the book of John sits in between them, but they're really part of the same book. And when you read Luke, you will notice Jesus repeatedly doing lots of things. Praying, teaching, healing, loving the poor and vulnerable, sharing meals with people, challenging oppressive authorities, crossing boundaries, taking time to be alone. When you read the book of Acts, what you see is the first Christians repeatedly doing the same exact things Jesus was doing in Luke. Praying, teaching, healing, loving the poor and vulnerable, sharing meals with people, challenging oppressive authorities, crossing boundaries, taking time to be alone. They were repeating exactly what they saw Jesus doing. You see, during those 3 years with Jesus, they cultivated habits and practices that helped them grow in their love for God and for their neighbors. And it is through repeated action that they experienced transformation. Way back in the day, the philosopher Aristotle taught that moral excellence comes about as a result of habit. We become just by doing just acts. Temperate by doing temperate acts. Brave by doing brave acts. And I think my life, if I'm honest with myself, I see that it is an example of that. I became more courageous by doing more courageous things. Right? We're not exactly sure what was going on with these people who received the letter of Hebrews. But we do know that the preacher was very concerned about their movement toward maturity. They were stagnant. They were regressing. They weren't growing. And so he uses this athletic imagery many times throughout his book to remind them that if they don't grow, that they won't grow if they aren't training, if they aren't practicing, if they aren't cultivating healthy habits that shape them to become more like Jesus. You know, if you all are like me, which I imagine many of you are in this regard, you likely go through seasons where you feel stuck. You go through seasons of your life where you feel stuck. Maybe you're not really working towards any goals. You're feeling spiritually just kind of stagnant. You feel like you're not progressing or growing, that there's no movement, that you're not where you want to be. I think often many of us feel like that more often than not. Hebrews teaches us about a good place to start. A good place to start is to look at our habits, our repeated actions, our movement. Are we cultivating sustained practices and habits over the long haul that help us grow in our love for God, our love for our neighbor, and our love for ourselves? Now, I want to give us just a few moments to just reflect for a minute. And I'll invite Camry, if you don't mind. Is Camry in here somewhere? If you don't mind playing us, music always helps me focus a little bit. Play us just a little bit of music while we think about this. But I have 3 questions I want y'all to consider, and I'm considering these myself as well this week. The first one is, how are your habits impacting your relationship with God, with others, and with yourself? And so think about your habits, the things you repeatedly do, your repeated actions. How are they impacting your relationship with God, with others, with yourself? You know, you may look at your life and you're like, man, I've been watching too much cable news and it's making me crazy, you know? And I imagine that could impact your life. You may be thinking, man, I'm not consistently getting together with other Christians, and that lack of community with others is really impacting my friendships and my understanding of myself. There may be lots of things that you could think of. For me, often I think of my habits and things like media and just like mind-numbing stuff with television and those things, and how they never really produce great fruit. Maybe your habits right now are leading you in a good direction and you feel good about where you're at, and that's awesome. Another question to consider is try to think of at least one new habit. And it may be an old habit that you just haven't really been doing much recently, but what is at least one new habit you can begin to cultivate in your life this week that'll help you grow in your love for God, grow in your love for others, or in love really with yourself? I like to add that yourself part. Jesus said that the 2 greatest commandments were to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And I think we're growing to understand that we can't love our neighbor or love God very well if we don't love ourselves well. And so we have to take care of ourselves also. For me, as I think about this, one habit that often just falls by the wayside is taking consistent time for silence and solitude each day. And one thing recently I've been trying to do, past couple weeks have been a little harder, but just taking at least 10 minutes a day just for like silence and centering prayer. And that can greatly impact literally the other almost over 23 hours of my day can be impacted just by those 10 minutes that I spend in centering prayer in the morning. But maybe there's a habit that you want to cultivate. Maybe it's getting involved in serving in some way or another, because maybe that can help to create more generosity and more love and more of a servant's heart in your life. But try to think of one habit. And then also the third thing is just a reminder that habits are formed through patience, through repetition, and long-term consistency. So the question is, how will you stick with your new habits over the long haul? Because often we start something with lots of gusto and lots of energy. I think the folks who received this sermon of Hebrews had a lot of energy at the beginning but trailed off. And so what are we going to do to help sustain these repeated actions for the long term? And maybe it's getting involved with a small group and having accountability in your life. Maybe it's consistently saying, I'm going to show up to church each week because I need that refocus. Maybe it's talking to your spouse about some goals that you have. Maybe it's journaling. Who knows? There's lots of different options there. But I just want to give us just a few moments to think through these a little bit. You can even jot down some of your ideas on your phone or on a piece of paper if you have that so you don't forget. But then after that, we'll share communion together and we'll close with a time of worship.